our speaker today, Professor Pankaj Mohan. You have his brief bio in the booklet, but I'd like to go through his illustrious CV with you just a little bit, if you would bear with me. Professor Mohan is the head of the Faculty of International Korean Studies at the Academy of Korean Studies. He studied East Asian languages and history, first at Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, and then at Seoul National, then Peking University, and finally at Australia National University, where he received his PhD in East Asian Studies. Prior to joining AKS, Professor Mohan taught Korean and East Asian Studies at the University of Australian National University, the University of Sydney, and also the University of Copenhagen. Truly a cosmopolitan and well-traveled man, I would have to say. His academic research and writing is truly interdisciplinary as well. Includes history, religious studies, and area studies. And his themes include Korean history, cultural interactions among East Asian countries, and contemporary history of nationalism in Asia. He's author of numerous books, such as Japanese Studies on the early Shilla Buddhism during the colonial period, and Spread and Accommodation of Buddhism in Taegaya, among many other publications. He is the chief editor of Korean Indian Culture, and he's also the editorial advisory board of several journals, including the Review of Korean Studies, Journal of Northeast Asian History, and International Journal of Buddhist Thought and Culture. I think we are really in for a treat this evening. Who better to tell us about Buddhism than a scholar from India? I was reminded, I actually just looked it up. It was in the 8th century that a very well-known Shilla monk, Hecho, who had to actually travel all the way to India to learn about Buddhism, but now we have Professor Mohan from the birthplace of India coming to tell us about Buddhism. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Professor Ham, for your introduction. Honorable President Kim Jong-bae, members of the diplomatic community, diplomatic corps, friends, and it is to intimate them, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to talk about the significance of Buddhism in ancient Korea. It means that I will talk about the formative phase of Buddhism and define the true character, define the character of Buddhism, which was shaped in the 6th and 7th centuries. So the first part of my lecture would deal with the formative phase, and finally, at the end of the lecture, I'll briefly talk about the attempt in contemporary Korea to revive that glorious tradition. How several monks in the late 20th century and even now are trying to cope with the challenges of the times, challenges posed by the popularity of other religions like Christianity, and look back towards the past for inspiration. Look at the ancient Buddhist monks. So it's a PowerPoint presentation, but first I will read the introduction, and then later on I'll summarize my points through different slides. So please bear with me if I read the first 1.5 pages. Throughout Asia, rulers channeled the rich resources of Buddhist symbolism to reinforce their authority and to validate their political imagination. Buddhism formulated its paradigmatic political theory of Chakravartin. Chakravartin is the notion of universal ruler. That's the political doctrine of Buddhism. And later I will try to explain how this Buddhist notion of kingship, known as Chakravartin, chakra means wheel, which is a cosmic symbol of cosmos. And Vartin means somebody who wields that wheel. So the concept of Chakravartin means the concept of universal ruler, or you can say cosmic sovereign, cosmocrat. So how this political theory of Chakravartin, a wheel turning universal ruler, and secular counterpart of Buddha, early in its history in recognition of the significance of kingship to the religion. Subsequently, King Ashoka of ancient India was elevated. Now is it clear to you now? Can you hear me? Okay. So subsequently, King Ashoka of ancient India was elevated in Buddhist historiography as an archetypal exemplar of the concept of Chakravartin, because his conquests, stretching from the Himalayas to the ocean, realized the imperial ideals of ancient India, and his support of the Dharma, that's the Buddhist law, and the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community, were similar achievements in the history of Buddhism. The Buddhist concept of Chakravartin, with its Ashokan paradigm, held particular appeal to monarchs in East Asia between the 4th and 7th centuries. So today in this talk, I will try to provide an understanding of the dynamic flow of Buddhist ideas on the Silk Road and further on to the early Korean state of Silla, focusing on the ways in which the ideas and ideals of Buddhism in early India were adapted to suit the political and cultural needs of North China and underwent further modification in Korea to suit its political and social needs. Although Buddhism equally served as an ideological prop of various early Korean states, early states that emerged in Northeast Asia, and most of the rulers in these states in North Asia invoked the rich and versatile Buddhist symbolism, the symbolism that I talked about earlier, rulers as Chakravartin, or rulers as Maitreya, which is the future Buddha, or as Bodhisattva. The forms in which these motifs and symbolism found expression varied according to local traditions and conditions in these lands. The period between the 4th and 7th centuries on the Korean peninsula is characterized by revolutionary changes. Traditional tribal pattern of politics was gradually replaced during the period by the new discourse on statecraft, informed by Buddhist cosmology. In the context of the Korean state of Silla, Buddhism underpinned the legitimacy of the ruling stratum of centralized unitary states as an ideology of cohesive force, as an ideology that unified the entire people, all the people who in the previous periods had different shamanistic beliefs and shamanistic religious roots. Because shamanism is associated with tribes, and Buddhism has universal ethics. It's based on scriptures, which have universal appeal and universal validity. That's why when Buddhism came to the Korean peninsula, it substituted tribal pattern of social structure and ideological belief and became the cohesive force, the unifying force of the Korean people. In the process of transition from a pre-state form to a centralized polity, the state is primarily concerned with shifting the allegiance and affiliation of the polity from local centers of power to the central authority. Promulgation of common set of laws and codes of behavior is doubtless important. But the state also obtains justification for the social order and ideology it's trying to develop from state-affiliated religious institutions and personnel. So, before discussing the points that I have outlined in my introduction, I will try to talk about the route through which Buddhism spread from India. So as you can see, so Nalanda, near Nalanda there is a Bodh Gaya. Nalanda is now getting international prominence because an international Buddhist center is being established under the leadership of Professor Amartya Sen of Harvard. So this area, Buddhism developed, and from here, so to Tunhuang, the Central Asian state, and from Tunhuang to China, and from China towards the Korean Peninsula, and further on to Japan. This is the route from which Buddhism developed. So two major factors which explain the popularity of Buddhism is the support of the royalty. And the second one is the universal ethics, universality of Buddhism, unlike Hinduism, which had caste-based social discrimination in its political and social structure, and which was very local in its spirit and orientation. Buddhism was a religion of universal orientation, of universal appeal. And that's why the southward diffusion of Buddhism from India to Sri Lanka and from Sri Lanka to the other states in Southeast Asia became successful, the first successful journey of Buddhist ideas. And later on, in about the 1st century, the eastward journey of Buddhism started from the Kashmir region to Tunhuang area. So the root, first of all, we need to understand the root of Korean Buddhism. What's the origin of Korean Buddhism? The character of Buddhism that was transmitted to the Korean Peninsula. So the defining features of Korean Buddhism can be understood in terms of Silk Road Buddhism. Now, on the Oasis states of Silk Road, rulers relied on the concept of Chakravartin in so many different texts that we find in the translations and also other annotations of Buddhist texts on the Silk Road. We find references to Chakravartin and also references to Maitreya. So the kings were identified as the future Buddha. In Buddhism, the historic Buddha is one amongst many Buddhas. There were the past Buddhas and there would be also the future Buddhas. The future Buddha is known as the Maitreya, the compassionate one, who is now residing in the Tusita heaven. Tusita heaven means the heaven of bliss. So the rulers channelized this resource of Maitreya by projecting themselves as the future Buddha. They said that the future Buddha had already descended in the form of the rulers. So for example, now the rulers of Khotan, so Vijaya Sambhava and Vijaya Vidya, they consider themselves as incarnations of Maitreya. And in the fresco of Kizil, a place in Tunhuang area, you find many Maitreya paintings. Now the second important feature of Silk Road Buddhism is the so-called merchant kings. So they controlled both economic and political resources of the state. So there was no dichotomy between the so-called profane money-making exercises and sacred, the spiritual or numinous realm of human life, of human existence. And what legitimized this merchant king's syndrome, merchant king's paradigm, is the text called the Holy Teachings of Vimalkirti. Now in this Holy Teachings of Vimalkirti, in Sanskrit it's known as the Vimalkirti Nirdesh Sutra. And you would see, I will show the representation of Vimalkirti in Tunhuang paintings. So Vimalkirti is an aristocrat in the text. But he doesn't find any dichotomy, any contradiction between the life of luxury, the life of affluence, and also the path of enlightenment. Because it's the spirit of sympathy with common people. feeling the pain, the suffering that common people have. That's the path of enlightenment and not pursuing a monastic career. So it's called non-duality of monkhood and lighting. That's the lay people. Now on the Silk Road Buddhism, we also find an important characteristic that shamanistic base was not abandoned. Buddhism was integrated within the native indigenous shamanistic base, the base of shamanism which prevailed before the arrival of Buddhism. And the divine character of kinship, the divine descent of kinship is also part of this shamanistic religious base. Now you can see here, so Tunhuang fresco, the Vimal Kirti is not a monk, but in the text he is depicted as even a greater and wiser person than Manjushri, who is the Bodhisattva of wisdom, who is the god or deity of wisdom in the Buddhist text. So this Vimal Kirti became an important icon of Buddhist world on the Silk Road. So now I talked about the shamanistic route of Buddhism on the Silk Road. It means, first of all, that the proto-Turkic tribes of Central Asia believed in the supra-normal power of iron and reckoned iron-smith as shamans. And we can find the same phenomenon in Silla. The first rulers of Silla were surnamed Kim, and Kim means iron. Kim originally meant iron, now it means gold. That's the original character of Kim, the initial rulers of Silla state. They also had the same religious foundation, religious belief, and the Put-based rituals also had important place in the world of religion in Silk Road. For example, the titles held by Aigur rulers was descendant of heaven, possessing the divine power of Put. Silk Road rulers believed in the supranormal power of the Buddha, and they turned towards Buddhism also because of the legend of great powers, magic and miracle that the Buddhist monks had. Now the emphasis on the royal lineage of Buddha was also important, because Buddha was born in a royal family. And this emphasis on the royal ancestry of Buddha became one of the important factors for the appeal of Buddhism amongst the royalty of the Silk Road rulers. So Buddha was described as a Buddha king, God amongst gods. So the kingship is important. And one point that I mentioned at the very outset is that the support of royalty, the monarchical support, was one of the most important reasons for the success of Buddhism in spreading in different countries. Now when Buddhism was disseminated to North China, because after the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century fell, China was divided into South, which was ruled by the Han rulers, and North, which was ruled by non-Han rulers. They were known as barbarian rulers, so Turkic tribes. Now here a further modification of Buddhism took place. Monk Faguo, he said that in worshipping the ruler, in worshipping the king, we worship the Buddha. So there is no difference between the royalty and the Buddha. And if you go to caves like Lungman Cave or Yunkan Cave in North China, you would see that the faces of the Buddha were shaped in resemblance of the present and past rulers. So if the ruler had a mole on the cheek, then the Buddha's face also had a mole on the cheek. So it was these statues were sculpted, these statues were made to project the power of the rulers and to make common people believe that there is no difference at all between the royal house and the lineage of the Buddha. So the mutually empowering relationship developed in these states, on the Silk Road and also in North China, between the Buddhism and monarchy. So now, looking at this background of Silk Road Buddhism and also Buddhism in the northern state of China, we try to understand the similarity, and we also try to find out the reasons why Silla rulers or rulers of Korea were so enthusiastic in patronizing Buddhism. Immediately, without any inhibition at all, Buddhism was patronized, Buddhism was supported by the rulers of Korea. First of all, Buddhism that developed on the Silk Road and in North China was not very alien to their own tradition. They saw in Silk Road Buddhism resemblance of some of the ideas and institutions that govern their own politics. For example, now the foundation myth of Korea and Silla rulers, so they had motives of divine descent, rulers descending from heaven, and also some shamanistic symbolism like horse. So egg birth of the founders of Korea and Silla, both were born from an egg. And both Chumong and Patkapase, so they, in their legends, we find the symbolism of horse. For example, now, Chumong worked as a stable boy, and the egg from which Patkapase came out was protected by one horse, white horse. So this was similar to the monarchical legends of Central Asian states. So hero seeking the help of animals to control the world of nature. Now, they believed, Central Asian states or Silk Road states believed that horses or deer possess divine power, perhaps because of their speed or because of their strength. And like rulers on the Silk Road, the rulers of early Korea were also shamans prior to the arrival of Buddhism. The title of early Silla king was Chathong or Chachaung. This means shaman. So the shamanistic Buddhism of Central Asia was something that catered to the interests and that filled the void that was created by in Silla. So if you look at the crown of Silla rulers, you would see that they are shaped like antlers horn. And antlers horn is shamanistic, basically shamanistic in its origin and meaning. Because these are the Silla crowns, and they are shaped in the resemblance of the horns of antlers. So in Siberia, even in the 19th century, shamans used to wear antlers horn before performing the shamanistic rituals. So Silk Road images. So Silla rulers were also impressed by Buddhism because the Silk Road Buddhism stressed supranormal power of the Buddha and of Buddhist monks. For example, in North China, we find examples of Fotu Tang. And I just give you one anecdote from the text Tao Sam Chuan, means biography of eminent monk. He persuaded Shala, ruler of the northern Chinese state of the later Zhao, to embrace Buddhism by chanting a spell and creating a lotus flower in a pot of water. And another example is Emperor Xianwan attributed the success to a Buddhist portent that had occurred in the newly annexed area 7 years earlier. In a war, emperor was successful, so he attributed this success to a portent. So magic, miracles, and supernormal power of monks, and also legends about Buddha that were predominant in the Silk Road Buddhism and also in northern China, somehow caught the attention and imagination of Silla rulers, and that's why they became enthusiastic in accepting Buddhism. Then what was the value of Buddhism to their state? Buddhism did not replace shamanism, didn't replace medicine men, but Buddhism was projected as a much more powerful shamanistic discourse. And Buddhist monks projected themselves as much more important, much stronger medicine men. Now this we find this anecdote is given in a Korean historical text. It says that Silla princess fell seriously sick and one Mukhoja was summoned to burn incense and pray. And when he did, the princess was immediately cured. So this prerogative, the responsibility of curing was discharged by shamans before Buddhism was transmitted to the Korean peninsula. But now Buddhist monks were able to perform this task with greater efficacy because they knew about the science of medicine. In Indian Buddhist monasteries, medicine was an important curriculum, and when Buddhist monks from India came to China, they also learned about the pulse technique. So both the theoretical and practical aspects of medicine were part of the Buddhist curriculum in monasteries. So when these Buddhist monks came to Korea, their skill in medicine was perceived as very useful and significant for the royal house. The second aspect can be summarized as Chinese cultural package. Because before the 4th century, Korean states were organized on a tribal pattern, and the king was not the centralized monarch. He wasn't the monarch of a centralized state. So different tribal settlements existed, and the king was just primus inter pares, first amongst equals. But now, when the society was moving in the direction of centralization, the state needed an ideology which could transcend the limitations, the barriers posed by the tribal pattern of social structure. And so, Chinese values, Chinese ideas, Chinese institutions were perceived as significant in the process of detribalization of popular consciousness. So with Buddhism came Confucianism. Same time as Buddhism came to the Korean peninsula, Confucianism came. Because in 372, Samguk Sagi, the Korean texts, both Samguk Sagi and Samguk Yusa say that Buddhism was first transmitted to the state of Buddha. And in the same year, 372, a Confucian school was established by the ruler. So it means that in early history, rulers did not differentiate between Buddhism and Confucianism. They perceived both of them as part of the continental civilization that came from Silk Road to North China and further on to the Korean peninsula. So this continental civilization, and of which writing system, Chinese writing system, accountancy, government structure, architecture, official hierarchical ranks, so they all form part of the Chinese cultural ensemble or cultural package. So this was perceived as an important element. So, as I have pointed out, so by rulers of early Korea, they were useful in their attempt to make a transition from a tribal form of state to a centralized bureaucratic state. Now we turn to the estate of Silla. There were three ancient estates, so Korea, Pache and Silla. And since Silla unified the Korean peninsula in 668, erasing the existence of Korea and Pache, I will focus on this estate. And it's very interesting that the names of first 5 rulers of Silla after Buddhism was introduced were all Buddhist names. For example, the ruler who accepted Buddhism was called Pop Hum, means rise of the Dharma, prosperity of the Buddhist Dharma, Buddhist law. His successor, Chin Hum, means rise of truth. And his successor, so Chinji, Chin means truth and Ji means truth and wisdom. Chinji's successor, Chin Tham, truth and peace. Chinfen was succeeded by 2 female rulers known as Sandak, goodness and virtue, and Chindak, truth and virtue. So you can see the era of Buddhist names was inaugurated immediately after the arrival of Buddhism. And it's also very interesting to note that the sons of King China were named Tong Nyun, bronze wheel, and iron wheel. I pointed out that Buddhism had the notion of Chakravartin, the political doctrine of Buddhism. Chakra is wheel, chakra means Sanskrit wheel, and there are 4 kinds of Chakravartin rulers. One is the golden wheel, who rules the entire universe, all the 4 parts of the universe. And silver wheel rules 3/4 of the universe. Bronze wheel, half of the universe, and iron wheel, 1 part of the universe, 1/4 of the universe. So now we need to understand why the ruler of Silla, King China, named his sons bronze wheel and iron wheel. And a legend was also created that time, linking him with King Ashoka. In my introduction, I pointed out that the King Ashoka was a ruler of India, and he was the first ruler who made Buddhism an international religion. He sent his son and daughter to Sri Lanka to propagate Buddhism. So, Samrakta and Mahendra. And he was also the first ruler to unify India, unify ancient India. So, political conquest and also religious evangelism were 2 important aspects of the period of King Ashoka. That's why in later history, in Buddhist historiography, he was depicted as the first historical Chakravarti, the first historical universal ruler. And the legend, according to the legend that we find in Korean historical texts written in the 12th and 13th centuries, King Ashoka put gold and iron and also a Buddhist triad. Triad means 3 statues. One statue of the Buddha flanked by 2 bodhisattvas. So the model of a Buddhist statue inside the ship with a prayer that the ship reached the land which was karmically connected with him, which was connected with Ashoka through some karma, good destiny. So the ship sailed for several centuries, and so many kings tried to mold the gold and iron that was put inside the ship into a Buddhist statue based on that model that was given, that also loaded. But none of the rulers succeeded in molding the metal into a Buddhist statue. Only the Korean King China was successful in using the metal successfully and molding the metal into a Buddhist statue. So this legend shows that the contemporary world of Buddhism tried to project King Jinam as King Ashoka, as somebody who was capable of unifying the Korean peninsula. Because during this period, the war with Korea and Pacha had started. It was the same process that developed in India in the 3rd century BC, the war of unification, peninsular unification, the war of conquest, and King Ashoka was successful in that war. Now, since King Jinam was engaged in the same process, grafting the legend about Ashoka on his political career had some political dimension. Now, another development took place during the reign of King Jinkan. So he called himself Changwang, that's the Chinese translation of Suddhodana, the father of the Buddha. And he called his wife Maya Kui, means Maya Devi, the mother of the Buddha. And the king's two brothers were also named after the two brothers of Suddhodana, the father of the Buddha, Suklodana and Pranodana. So this signified the fact that the royal house of Silla was now trying to forge an affinity and identity with the lineage of the Buddha. Because the contemporary Korean society was also class-based society. It's called Pol-Fung system. Pol means bone and Fung means rank, bone rank system. The aristocracy and the royalty came from the true bone. And below the true bone, there were different ranks, head rank 6, head rank 5, head rank 4. Now, head rank 6 was not eligible to assume any important top political position or to become rulers, only the true bone. Now, the royalty fabricated the legend, invented a new tradition of its affinity and identity with the clan of the Buddha, and thereby created a new class. This class was known as the sacred bone. So during this period, a new class emerged, the sacred bone class. And this class became the preserve of the royalty, the monopoly of the royalty. And thereby, the royalty distinguished itself from the aristocracy belonging to the true bone in terms of prestige, power, and sacrality or sacredness. Because originally in Chinese text, this sacred bone, these two Chinese characters, Sun Tu or Sun God, were used for the relics of the Buddha. So they were used to describe the relics of the Buddha, but now in the context of Silla, they had a new meaning, the meaning of a class of royalty who had sacred lineage. Bone means lineage or ancestry. So, and as you can see, the Maitreya symbolism was also harnessed by the Silla royalty. There was a group of an order of aristocratic youths in Silla known as Parang. Pa means flower and Rang means boy. So the flower boys, order of flower boys. And the legend was created that the Maitreya, the future Buddha, had descended to the earth in the form of flower boys. So the flower boys, or the Parang, was the linchpin of Silla society and politics, because great generals, Kim Il-sung, and also Sadaham, and other great scholars all came from the ranks of the Parang. So linking Maitreya with the Parang order, with the Parang tradition, also had a very subtle and important political implication and political meaning. Now, Kim Il-sung, many of you must have heard about Kim Il-sung, who was architect in the unification of Silla in the 7th century. He had his followers, the Hwarang followers, he was the leader of Hwarang, and his followers were known as Yonghwa Hyangdo, the fragrant followers of dragon flower tree. Now, dragon flower tree had association with Maitreya, because according to the Maitreya text, when he would descend from the heaven to the earth, the Maitreya would preach under the dragon flower tree. So using this kind, the word dragon flower for the Maitreya, for the Hwarang order is important in this context. And you can see also, so the crown of Maitreya is also shaped in resemblance of the royal crown. Now we turn towards the functions of monks. So I talked about symbolism of Buddhism, how rulers used Buddhist symbolism, symbolism of Chakravarti, symbolism of Maitreya, symbolism of Bodhisattva. So the first important monk of Silla in the 6th century was monk Wanquan, 6th and early 7th century. He gave 5 commandments, instructions to the Hwarang. So serve the king with loyalty, serve your parents and be filial. Treat friends with sincerity. Do not retreat from battlefield. Be discriminate in taking life. So the first 3 are taken from Confucianism. And the other 2 reflect the contemporary political and social circumstances of Silla. Because Silla was engaged in the battlefield, and that's why the Buddhist notion of non-killing, no taking of life, had to be modified. And that's why the 5th one says, be discriminate in taking life. So it's kind of equivalence between the Buddhist doctrines, the imported tradition, and the contemporary reality of Silla. Now, he also wrote a letter to the emperor of Sui Dynasty, China, where he studied for a few years. And in that letter, he requested him to dispatch forces, dispatch military help to assist Silla's war against Korea. He said that as a Buddhist monk, he shouldn't have requested the ruler of China to send forces to Korea, because the military forces engaged in battle. But since he lived in the land ruled by the monarch, the royal command had precedence over the Buddhist command. So here also you can see how Buddhist doctrines were being modified and adjusted to suit the contemporary circumstances. Now there was another monk called Chajang, 7th century. He said that Queen Sandak was not an ordinary ruler, because the rivals of Silla, Korea and Pache, considered her as weak, because she was the first ruler in the history of Silla who was a female ruler. Naturally, she was perceived as a weak monarch. But he said that she belonged to the same caste as the caste of the Buddha, and therefore she represented bravery and sacredness. He also asked the ruler to construct 9-story pagoda in the Yellow Dragon Temple, stating that each story of the pagoda would represent Silla's victory over one estate, one of the 9 neighboring states that Silla had. So 9-story pagoda means Silla's victory over all the 9 countries that surrounded Silla. So 9 can also mean just totality. When the concept of 0 was not invented, 9 meant complete or total. So Silla's complete victory over neighbors. So he declined to accept official position, but he was deeply enmeshed or deeply integrated within the political project of their state that I have discussed. I'm just summarizing some of the points, but I have discussed these points in detail, which you can read at your leisure. So you can see the nine-story pagoda. This is the projection. And you can also imagine its perceived effect in the contemporary times. So, one important Silla monk is Vanya. So he was the first monk in the history of Silla who popularized, who brought Buddhism to the doors of the common people. He went from house to house preaching that by chanting Namu Amidapur, homage to the Amitabha Buddha, everybody could go to paradise. And because of his movement, about half of the population of Silla at that time became Buddhist. Now, one of the legends about him is that he was trying to go to China to learn about Buddhist doctrines, but somewhere in Manchuria, he had to take shelter from a storm. And then he entered a cave, and at night he drank a bowl of water. And then he went back to sleep again. In the morning, he realized that what he regarded as a cave last night was a dilapidated tomb. And the sweet, thirst-quenching bowl of water was just a liquid in a human skull. So he was astonished at the power of the human mind to transform reality. So he said, all phenomena arise when the mind arises. The entire phenomenal world is the projection of human mind. So there is nothing profane and nothing sacred. All things are created by projected by mind. So, awakening from Buddha, the three worlds are mind only and everything is consciousness only. So, you can see these, the main characteristic of Buddhism, the defining features of Buddhism in the early decades and the early centuries was equation between the Buddhist doctrine and also the contemporary reality of Silla. Now I will just briefly talk about the deviation of Buddhism in the subsequent centuries, how Buddhism lost its appeal amongst the common people, and how in the contemporary society, some Buddhist monks are trying to revive the old tradition. Now it's clear from the overview of the development of Buddhism during the formative phase that Buddhism forged an inalienable linkage, a very close tie with the destiny of the state and also with the life of the people. Buddhist rhetoric and rituals were used to authenticate the political imagination of rulers in their attempt to create a centralized monarchical structure. Buddhism also served as a source of ideological unity of the state from the 4th century when it was introduced to the late 14th century when the Joseon dynasty replaced Buddhism with Confucianism as the guiding ideology of the state. During the Joseon dynasty, due primarily to the state persecution of Buddhism, this religion lost its vitality. And it also lost the rhythmic touch with the reality of the country. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Christianity was successful in expanding its appeal amongst the common people because the root of Buddhism amongst the masses had become very weak. A modern Buddhist reformer, Han Yong-gun, made an insightful comment in one of his essays published in 1920. He said, Buddhism doesn't reside only in temples. It doesn't exist merely in the scriptures. Buddhism exists truly in the spiritual life of the common people. And its significance, the significance of Buddhism, lies in leading human beings on the path of self-awakening or discovery of their spiritual power. I hope, Han Yong-gun, the Buddhist reformer, wrote, the world of Buddhism hears the heart throb of the common people and identifies itself with the life of the common people. So he suggested in one of his essays called Reformation of Buddhism that Buddhist monks should not be parasites of the society but should engage in productive activities. And Buddhist curriculum should also be revised, and monks should not just pass their time reading about the ancient philosophy, Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist doctrines, but also modern history and also modern science. Now, in the recent decades, the world of Korean Buddhism seems to have realized the truth in Han Yong-moon's message and has woken up to his call. For example, now, monk Tap-up, who once served as Secretary General of the Choge Order, the largest Buddhist order in Korea, established Indranet movement. The word Indranet comes in the Hawaiian scripture called Hwa Am in Korean, Hwa Am Pyam, in Chinese Hwa En, or in Sanskrit of Tansika. So the Indranet is a metaphor. So each knot of the net has a diamond. And when the net is thrown, then the light and image of each diamond in the net refracts and reflects one another. So one diamond of the knot has the image of all the other diamonds in that net. So interpenetration of human existence. Nothing is independent. Everything is based on the theory of mutual interdependence. So now this Tap-up has initiated his movement, new movement called Indranet movement, which has 5 components. The first is Back to Farm campaign, and the second is Cooperative Livelihood campaign, and Alternative Education campaign, Sustainable Environment campaign, Ecology Community campaign. One of my PhD students who is also here is doing work on this topic. So social engagement of Buddhism. So as you can see, the world of Buddhism today is trying to come to terms with the reality, and also it's also trying to learn from the words and deeds and acts of the past heroes of the world of Buddhism, like Monk Wonpa, Monk Chajang, and Monk Wanyo. So the Indranet movement promotes biomass utilization, organic farming, and it also teaches agricultural technology to the unemployed youth. Its vision of alternative education seeks to instill such qualities as compassion, integrity, and fellow feeling amongst the youth. Now, another important monk is Popcham. He died recently. Monk Popcham, he died a few months ago. He started a movement called Fresh and Fragrant Society. He gives the example of flowers. And he says that flower, when you look at the process of the blooming of flower, you just don't take it for granted. You must reflect on the amazing mystery, the mystery of the blooming of the flower. And think, you must think, whether you also bloom forth everything that's fresh and fragrant within your heart. Do you also give vent, articulate everything that's sacred, that's sweet, and fragrant, that exist in your own body and in your own mind? So like the blooming of the flower, you should also, every human being should bloom forth, giving to the society everything that's good, that's beautiful, and that's useful for the society in general. So he also wrote several books and made Buddhism accessible to the common people. There is a poem written by monk Supyam. And that poem says, the river is dying, the mountains are dying, becoming asphalt. And we no longer hear the teachings of the Vimal Kirti. I told you about the Vimal Kirti. The teachings of the Vimal Kirti, that your suffering is my suffering. We no longer hear the teachings of the Hawaiian scripture. I am your root and you are my root. We are each other's root. So as you can see, the old ideals of Silla monks that I described through different slides, the ideals and the ideas of affinity between Buddhism, society and the state somehow vanished in the 500 years of the Joseon dynasty, and there has been an attempt in the recent times to revive that tradition and to make Buddhism once again hear the heartthrob of the common people and make Buddhism connected with the pulse of the times. Thank you very much.